Good afternoon and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens. Let's Talk Gardens. I'm Cindy Brown. I'm Manager of Education Collections and Access here at Smithsonian Gardens, and we're thrilled to have you. I know I say that every week, but every week I'm thrilled with our speakers. I'm thrilled with what information we get to share with you. I'm thrilled with what I get to learn about and who we have on board with us. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit of housekeeping first, and then I'll introduce our speaker, and then our speaker will take it away and introduce you to some new ideas. So, as always, please put your questions in the chat box. You are able to record the chat box if you would like to be able to keep the links that we put in the chat box. So Zach will put some information in there to let you know how you do save the chat if you're interested in that. And we will stop our program, of course, at 1 o'clock and get outside because today is a beautiful day. We're glad that you left your gardening behind for a couple minutes and then you're with us as well. So today we're going to talk about trees. And trees are so important to us at Smithsonian Gardens because we have an official Smithsonian tree collection. It is probably, well, it definitely is one of our most visible collections because you can see it around the whole campus at the Smithsonian. But it's also one of our most important collections because it does so much for our city, so much for our urban areas, so much for our campus. It is one collection that really makes a huge difference on how we live and how we promote what we do here at Smithsonian Gardens. So Murphy Westwood is from the Morton Arboretum. She's also enjoying a beautiful day today. And she's going to talk to us about a study that she's been involved with, which has really gone international, about the importance of our trees and, more importantly, what's going to happen to our trees in the future. So Murphy, I'm going to just go ahead and disappear, but I'll be back to answer questions from the audience, ask them to you at the end. And I want you to be able to jump right in and tell us all about your study and information.
Great. Thank you, Cindy, so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And yes, trees are important. We have long recognized that at the Morton Arboretum. And this is like you said, this is a study we've been working on that culminated basically in a publication last year, which is what I'm going to be talking about. And I hope that the information is useful to your listeners and that we can all see a role for ourselves in how we can be working to protect the native US tree diversity that is under threat. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about my organization. So I am based at the Morton Arboretum. It's a large public garden in the western suburbs of Chicago. We have 1,700 acres here, about half of which is in managed living collections of woody plants from around the world. And the other half is in managed and restored natural areas like wetlands, one of the best restorations of a tall grass prairie, and woodlands, lots of oak habitat, especially here. So please come visit us if you're ever in the area. I also want to start by acknowledging that the Morton Arboretum is located on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, and many other tribes that resided on or migrated through this land for generations. So please join me in recognizing these enduring communities and the many Indigenous peoples residing throughout the Chicago region today. We invite you to learn more about them and the Arboretum's commitment to supporting Indigenous peoples at mortonarb.org. And I also want to start my talk with my thank yous. It was a really huge effort and a really long-term project and a large undertaking. The people here and the organizations on the right who helped fund and support this project over the last 7 years are really our fantastic collaborators. This work couldn't have been done without the people here on this list, but I also want to recognize that the work that we did to understand the extinction risk of US trees involved dozens, and I would say probably hundreds of other botanists and field conservationists, state botanists, people working in natural areas, public garden staff across the country. So this is truly a labor of love for dozens, probably hundreds of people who helped us gather data, review assessments, the folks who really understand these plants in the wild. And I just want to extend huge thank you to everybody that was part of this project. So today I'm going to be talking about the US tree assessment, and I'm going to put it first of all in the broader context of a project called the Global Tree Assessment, which is the umbrella initiative under which we started this project and what we were inspired by. I'm going to give you some background on the threat assessment platforms that are currently in use in the United States today, which are the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN Red List, and NatureServe's Global Ranks. So I'll describe those two complementary platforms that we currently use to assess risk. I'm then going to tell you about the process that we went through to create the checklist of US trees that we then went on to assess. And I'm going to tell you about the results of the project and the state of trees today. And then I'm going to spend some time to talk about how we can all take action, how the work that we do in our home gardens, in our urban and community areas, really can support tree conservation and threatened species that are, that maybe feel quite disparate, quite, oh, well, these are trees that are maybe out in the wilderness areas, and what can I actually do at home? And I would like to argue that there is a lot that we can all do at home to make a big difference. And then I'll just summarize with some conclusions and key messages, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. So let's start with some kind of baseline understanding of why we did this project. And I think that I hope that it won't be a surprise to anybody here that we are currently in the midst of a biodiversity crisis on the planet. So it's been called the 6th mass extinction event that we are going through today. And I think, are hearing in the news all the time about how we are losing plant and animal species to extinction, in many cases before we've even had the chance to formally describe them to science. This image on the left is a report that came out from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in the UK, called The State of the World's Plants and Fungi. And they started this project a few years ago, and they've been doing it annually. And it's a really interesting report about the state of our plants. And in this report in 2020, they estimated that 2 in 5 of the world's plants are threatened with extinction. So I think we hear about this in the news a lot, this idea of a biodiversity crisis, but I want to sort of address that there may be questions around, like, well, how do we know that? Like, how do we know how many species we're losing? Where do these numbers come from, this 2 in 5 being threatened with extinction? And the way that we actually arrive at those numbers is through processes of evaluating data that we have to understand the risk of extinction at a species by species level. So we do what is called a threat assessment, or also a conservation assessment. I might use those terms interchangeably in this talk. And it essentially means examining a species and all of the information and data that we have about a species to understand what is its risk of extinction in the very near future. And scientists and conservationists and natural historians have been doing this for decades. And yet there are certain groups of organisms out there that have been investigated in much more detail and much more thoroughly than others. So, for example, birds and mammals have been very well assessed. Almost all of the species have been assessed, and in many cases, many times over. So we had an estimate of the risk of extinction of a species maybe 40 years ago, and then someone looked at it again 30 years ago and 20 years ago, and maybe last week. And so we have a really good understanding of how a species has done its sort of trajectory over time for those groups of organisms. One group of organisms that was very poorly known up until just a few years ago was trees. we had very little understanding of the state of the world's trees. In fact, we didn't even know how many tree species there were in the world until a couple of years ago. And so that really brought to light the need for understanding the state of the world's trees. And that was fundamentally the inspiration for this broader global effort called the Global Tree Assessment. And this was really spearheaded by an organization called Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is a conservation NGO based in the UK, in London, but with offices around the world. And they partnered with the International Union for Conservation of Nature Global Tree Specialist Group to motivate and inspire public gardens, but also universities and other plant experts, botanists, to motivate globally and work together for this goal of creating conservation assessments or threat assessments for all of the world's roughly 60,000 tree species by the year 2020. So this initiative kicked off in 2015. It was a very ambitious goal to assess that many species in such a short amount of time. And in the last 7 years that it's been going on, there are now over 60 institutional partners involved in this effort and 500 tree experts from around the world contributing data and information and working their way through this big list of trees. When we started this effort in 2015, there were probably fewer than 10 or 15% of those 60,000 tree species that had been assessed at that point. So a huge amount of effort and work has gone into this. And I've been working closely with BGCI, this Botanic Gardens Conservation International, for almost 10 years. And I was, in meetings with them early on in the global tree assessment process. And I and several of my colleagues that were on that acknowledgement slide earlier on said, well, we should really be doing this for the US. I wonder what the state of US trees is, because we wanted to make sure that our native tree diversity was being recognized and captured in this big global effort. And so that was in about 2017, we said, okay, we're going to take a look at this for the US. What does it look like for our diversity here at home? And the way that we went about doing that was taking a look at the two most commonly used and recognized assessment platforms that are well recognized in the United States. And so the two different mechanisms for assessing threat of plant and animal species is the IUCN Red List and NatureServe. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those two different sort of methods or frameworks now. So both the Red List and NatureServe use similar types of data, which are demographic data like ecological data, population size. So for a given species, how big is the population? How fragmented are the populations? Are they declining? Are there real, obvious, immediate threats? Are they commonly used by humans for food or selectively harvested for timber? Those are the sorts of data that you gather when you want to understand the extinction risk for a species. Now, for the Red List, it was established in 1964, and it is the most widely recognized assessment platform globally. So anywhere in the world, you can take a species and you can apply the Red List to it. It is also the global tree assessment platform of choice. So because it's the most widely recognized and globally applicable framework for assessing threat, that was what the GTA wanted all of these assessments to eventually be done with, using that particular framework. The Red List assessments are researched and reviewed by a global network of scientists and conservationists. And in 2015, when I and my colleagues started this project for the US trees, US trees were very poorly represented. There were fewer than 300 tree species on the Red List, and you can go to see the Red List now. It's at it's www.iucnredlist.org, and you can search and filter. It's a really cool website. You can look up your favorite tree or animal species on there. And if you filter backwards and take a look before 2015, there are fewer than 300 species designated as a tree from the US on the Red List. So that shocked me, actually, because the US has a very well-known flora. We are a very well-resourced country. We have a whole lot of practicing botanists and tree experts. And for our trees to be so poorly represented was really quite a surprise. So we realized we actually had a big job to do. Now, the other threat assessment platform that's commonly used in the US is NatureServe. And NatureServe it was established in 1978. It's widely used throughout North America, especially by state and federal agencies. So NatureServe assessments are actually researched and reviewed by a network of natural heritage programs, especially at the state level. And so NatureServe and these state and federal agencies work much more closely together than I think than our federal agencies, for example, use the Red List to influence or inform policy. So in that sense, they're sort of two complementary but not identical platforms. They sort of have different audiences and different uses, essentially. Now, NatureServe had a very robust database and data set, and US trees were actually well represented as of 2015. So NatureServe has a taxonomic backbone. It has a sort of checklist, and plant species get designated with a habit there of like a herbaceous plant or a shrub or a tree. And as of 2015, 97% of the species that were designated as a tree in the biotics database, which is what the NatureServe database is, had been assigned a rank. So 97% of the trees had been assessed, but 3/4 of those assessments were more than 10 years old. And for both the Red List and NatureServe, 10 years is sort of the like gold standard for wanting to have something as recently done as that. So it's almost like the assessment expires after 10 years because we know that conservation status can change rapidly. New threats arise, development happens, extreme weather events may wipe out populations. So we know that we're only ever looking with these assessments at a snapshot in time. And it's kind of a constant effort to make sure they stay up to date. And so we want to make sure that our assessments are done at least every 10 years. And so while NatureServe had assessments for many more species than the Red List, a lot of those were out of date. So that was the state of play in about 2015 when we started talking about this project. Another thing I want to clarify right now is sort of how the Red List and the NatureServe actually work when it comes to classifying species. So the Red List uses a series of categories that it will assign a species to. So I'm going to explain this matrix on the left-hand side, starting from the bottom going up. So the vast majority of plant and animal species on Earth probably sit in the not evaluated category. There hasn't been an expert or a botanist or a biologist who sat down and said, I'm going to take this species and gather all of this information and apply this framework. So many groups of organisms, like insects, for example, a whole lot of those in the not evaluated category. This is where many of our trees were before we started this project. Now, let's say you've gathered a bunch of that data that you could get your hands on. How many individuals are out there? Where are these populations? Are they fragmented? Are there threats? Are the population sizes declining? That type of demographic and ecological and threat and use information. So you gathered all that information together, and then you filter it through this framework of assessments where you sort of reach these critical thresholds to say if something is threatened or not. You may find that you just don't have enough information. Maybe that species is just very poorly known, or there might be taxonomic concerns. You're not actually really clear. Is it a species, or is it a hybrid, or is it two different species? That might be a situation where you would say that the species has been evaluated, but found to be data deficient. So we have, again, many species on Earth that fall into this data deficient category. We've started to gather the information, but we're just not sure. We don't have enough yet to confidently assign one of the threat categories. So that's not evaluated and data deficient. Moving up from there, you get to least concern and near threatened. So these are species that are probably fairly widespread. We have enough robust information to assess them using this framework, And what we have found is that there just aren't very big threats. The species is doing pretty well. It might be declining a little bit, maybe in that near threatened category, but it's nowhere near a drastic situation that we're deeming it a threatened species yet. And so many species fall into this least concern or near threatened category. Above that, you start to get into the threatened categories. And for the red list, those terms are vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And there are several different ways that a species may qualify for one of these threatened categories. For example, in population size, something that's a vulnerable species would have, let's say, it would have 10,000 individuals left in the wild. A critically endangered species might only have 50 individuals left in the wild. So we kind of parse these different species out and we assign them these categories based on thresholds that they meet, based on things like population size, how rapidly the populations are declining. You know, there are a few different categories, a few different ways that you can become a threatened species or deemed a threatened species. And then beyond one of those threatened categories of vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, you get to extinct in the wild. That would be a situation where you have, you know, for example, Franklinia alatamaha, which is one of our few US extinct in the wild trees, exists nowhere in its native habitat or in the wild. It only exists in cultivation. So we only have that species in public gardens, basically, or in living collections or in cultivation outside of its historic range, its native range. Extinct is obviously something that exists nowhere on Earth. We don't have it in the wild. We don't have it in living collections. We don't have it in a seed bank. It is extinct. We've lost it forever. Those are the red list categories. NatureServe has comparable and sort of complementary categories that have similar names, identical names in some cases, but the system is ever so slightly different. It uses similar data, but it has a slightly different way of setting those thresholds and kind of weighing the evidence, that you can't draw a one-to-one line between, for example, a critically endangered species on the red list and a critically imperiled species on NatureServe. So it's a little bit frustrating, a little bit confusing that there are two very similar and kind of parallel platforms that are at work in the US, but they actually can really complement each other well. And I think it's another good way of just making sure that we are capturing wherever we can these species that may be sliding into extinction. So NatureServe uses similar data. Like I said, you apply these different categories. It has a system where you sort of filter the data through and you can determine a category for a species. Again, these are kind of going from lower to higher extinction risk from the bottom to the top. So you can be secure, apparently secure, vulnerable, imperiled, or critically imperiled. And with NatureServe, you can assess a species at a global, national, or subnational level. So a global assessment would be for that species across its entire range, whether it's just in the US or maybe it's in the US and Canada, or it's in the US and Mexico. That would be the global assessment for that species. You can also run the system through at a national level and get just what the extinction risk is for those populations present, for example, in the United States. And then there's a subnational level. That's actually a very commonly used feature of NatureServe. In the US especially, we do that at the state level. So you may have heard that something is like state endangered in your state. That would be a NatureServe assessment at the subnational level. So something might be critically imperiled in the state of Georgia. So like an S1 assessment of critically imperiled in Georgia. But in Florida, it's not, you know, it's maybe not critically imperiled, maybe it's just vulnerable, an S3 in Florida. So that's the full picture of what NatureServe's assessment platform does. For our project, we were only looking at global statuses. So we essentially did not use the national or subnational feature of that assessment platform. So For the rest of the talk, I'm going to be giving our results based on the Red List assessment and the NatureServe assessment at the global scale, so a G rank for NatureServe. And then just to sort of reiterate, there isn't a like exact one-to-one relationship between these two platforms, either in terms of like a vulnerable assessment on the Red List doesn't always equal exactly a vulnerable on NatureServe. It's usually pretty close, but not identical. The other thing that doesn't really work terribly well is data sharing between those two platforms. So when we started this project at the Morton Arboretum, my team was very interested in Red List assessments, and we were trained and working with the Red List assessment platform, but we recognized the importance of the data and the expertise that was available through the NatureServe network and that system. And so NatureServe has been a core partner in this program since day one. And we worked closely with them through this entire process. And one of the goals that we had was to try to share data from these underlying databases that these two systems use so that we weren't duplicating effort. Because essentially what you used to have to do is go through the whole process for the Red List and then go through the whole process all over again for NatureServe. And so we said, if we're going to be doing all these tree assessments, let's see if there's a way that we can streamline that process a bit better. So ultimately, the goals of our US tree assessment project were to address the lack of US tree species on the IUCN Red List and to update those out-of-date NatureServe Global Ranks. We wanted to ultimately ensure that the US was contributing to the Global Tree Assessment Initiative and that our native trees were being recognized and captured at this standardized global scale. We wanted to create an easily accessible checklist of US tree species, and our geographic focus for this was the contiguous 48 United States. And our rationale for that is that Hawaii, which is another very biodiverse, one of our most biodiverse and interesting states, also very threatened biodiversity, Hawaii has its whole own specialist group focusing on assessments for Hawaiian plant and animal diversity. And so they were kind of well underway working in Hawaii. Puerto Rico, similarly, and the USVI has an initiative to do assessments for those two territories. So we focused on the contiguous 48 United States. It is also sort of botanically makes more sense because you tend to have trees that don't necessarily listen to state boundaries. And so we wanted to kind of make sure that we were doing this kind of broader geographic scale. We wanted to develop a comprehensive picture of the state of extinction risk of US trees. And then our hope was that a byproduct of this effort was also going to be that streamlining of data and data sharing between the IUCN Red List and the NatureServe database. So those were the goals that we kind of set out to achieve back in 2015, 2016, when we were kicking all of this off. So I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about creating a checklist of US trees, which I didn't initially think was going to be a hard part of this project because we have many checklists already of US trees. But here's the tricky thing. I want everyone to think for a second about what is a tree. And that may seem like an odd question, and you're probably sitting there thinking, this lady needs to get a new job if she works at an arboretum and doesn't know what a tree is. But actually, it's a tricky question. There is no biological definition of a tree, not in quite the same way there is for like a fruit or a leaf, for example. So picture in your mind a tree. It probably looks like perhaps this maple, right? I think we can all agree that that is a tree. What about a spruce? Is that a tree? Yes, I would say that's a tree, definitely a tree. What about this shrubby witch hazel? It's multi-stemmed, it's maybe only 10 or 12 feet tall, doesn't have, a single strong central stem with an arborescent, feel. Is that a tree? What about a palm tree? It's very tree-like, but palms are monocots. They don't actually make technical wood. So is that a tree? What about a Joshua tree? the name tree. I mean, it's in its name, but is that really a tree? What about the saguaro cactus? Kind of tree-like, but it's a cactus. Is that a tree? So I think you can see that like actually creating a checklist of trees is a little bit, there's a whole lot of nuance to it. So luckily we actually didn't have to necessarily invent this wheel. We were able to rely on the global tree assessment, which, as you'll recall, had just kicked off at this global scale. They realized in trying to motivate and create this initiative that we needed a standardized definition of a tree that everybody was working off for this particular effort. And so their definition of a tree, this is that IUCN Global Tree Specialist Group, was to define a tree as a woody plant with usually a single stem growing to a height of at least 2 meters, or if multi-stemmed, then at least one vertical stem 5 centimeters in diameter at breast height. Now, this definition was published in an article that was led by the team at BGCI and that Global Tree Specialist Group in the Journal of Sustainable Forestry, where they kind of defined the tree and outlined the scope of what this challenge was going to be. And that's a cool paper. I would recommend people checking that out. But that was the definition of a tree that was our guiding light for the global tree assessment. So we used that definition and then went back to look at what are the checklists of trees that we currently have in the US. And there are many floras or checklists or natural history books about trees in the native trees of the US. 3 of the very commonly used sort of standardized checklists or resources are listed here on this table, but there are in fact many more. There's a checklist that E.L. Little published for the US Forest Service in 1979. Biota of North America runs a really great plant database. USDA plants, the database that the USDA uses, which has a great taxonomic backbone. These things all existed already, but you'll see that the definition that these databases use is not actually the same. First of all, there's variation in how each of these databases or checklists define what a tree is. There are sometimes exceptions. Some of these checklists didn't match our geographic scope. And you'll also note that these checklists have like wildly different numbers, right? 748 tree species, 1,114 tree species, 976. So we didn't really know where to start. So what we had to do was basically reconcile what was already out there, these different checklists of US trees, and the fact that NatureServe itself has a taxonomic backbone with a designation of tree, shrub, herbaceous plant, but we had to kind of double check all of those against the global tree assessment definition of a tree. So we essentially did that for all of the trees that were kind of designated in any of these databases as a tree. We double checked it against the database. We also had to resolve some taxonomic issues between these different databases. So this was actually a big part of the project that I was not expecting it to be. So that's kind of where we were when all of this started in, we kind of officially kicked off in 2017. And last year, 5 years later, we published this paper, which is essentially the results. And this is what I'm going to be talking about. And this is what a lot of my next sort of like tables and conclusions and understanding the state of US trees. The data are all available, and most of the tables and things I'm showing are in this paper. And I think Zach's going to pop that in the chat box for us too, so that you can go right to it. But this QR code will get you there on your phone as well. So what did we find? Well, let's start by going through that checklist. What did we find when we resolved all of those different resources that were out there and matched them up against this global tree assessment tree definition? What we did was created a checklist of data fields that included our family, genus, and species of all of the entities that we recognized as trees in the lower 48 United States. We listed the taxonomic authority, the country level and state level distribution. So where was that tree currently found? Whether or not the tree was endemic to the contiguous United States, So meaning found only in the US, in the lower 48 and nowhere else on Earth. We list in our checklist and in this paper, the IUCN Red List category, as well as the NatureServe assessment category and the year that it was last assessed, so that you can see if something's like coming up for needing to be renewed sometime soon. We compared our list and these assessments to the trees that are receiving federal protections under the Endangered Species Act. And so we have that whether or not it's a federally listed species in our checklist. We also provide the number of ex situ collections, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on, but essentially that's the number of botanic gardens, number of living collections that the species is currently growing in or conserved in. And we also included in our checklist, and that's part of this supplementary material for that paper, a tab of the species that we excluded from our checklist, usually because of reasons of taxonomy. Like there was taxonomic debate, or we deemed something to be a subspecies, not a species, and we were only assessing at species level for this project. Whether it was native or not to the US, we did not assess non-native species in this project. And sometimes something wasn't included because it was a shrub in the lower 48 United States. So for those taxa that sort of nearly made it in, we provided this tab of species we excluded and why, because there's probably going to be debate. We hear people saying all the time, why isn't this on your list, or why is that on your list, and it shouldn't be. And so we actually encourage that. The paper has information about how you can help us improve the list and where you can send feedback to. So all of this is available. It's downloadable. I hope you can use it. I hope you can use it and filter it, and what's in my state and what's threatened in my state and what's in my nearest botanic garden. Those are all sorts of questions you can ask with this data. So what did we find? Let's talk about those results. Our checklist of US trees contains 79 families, 269 genera, and 881 species of tree that is native to the lower 48 states. 294 species of those 881 are endemic to the contiguous 48. So they are in the US there and nowhere else on Earth. Oaks, the genus Quercus, has 85 species, and hawthorns, the genus contiguous, which has 84 species. Those two tree groups dominate our native tree flora. The next most species-rich genus is, I think, Salix, the willows, and I think it's in the 40s number of species they have. So oaks and hawthorns are by far the most species-rich tree groups in the US. 9 other genera have more than 10 tree species. So, and these are just a couple examples of white oak and one of our hawthorn species. So where in the US do our trees exist? So we did a sort of geographic assessment of where our native tree hotspots are. And so these two maps show species richness by state. On the left-hand side are our native trees, and on the right-hand side are the trees that are endemic. So on the left, you'll see that Texas and Florida have the most number of tree species in the US, with over 300 native tree species. California and the Southeast are other tree hotspots. When it comes to endemic trees, so trees that are found only in the US, Georgia leads with over 150 endemic native tree species in Georgia. So those aren't state endemics, it's just species that are endemic to the US that are in the state of Georgia too. So Georgia has a lot of those. Again, California, Texas, and the Southeast are where we have quite a lot of tree richness in the US. Now let's talk about the threat assessments that we did. So we know we have these 881 tree species. We knew that fewer than 300 of them were on the red list when we started this project. So since 2017, we have assessed 563 tree species for the red list. Some of that is assessing old, expired assessments, and some of that is our species that have never been assessed. A lot of that is species that were never assessed before. So that was a threefold increase over what was on the red list when we started this project. For NatureServe, we assessed 109 species. Many of those were updates to very old species that had been assessed already on NatureServe. So I'm pleased to report that we now have over 96% of our US tree species represented and assessed on both of those two platforms. So a very big improvement and a much better understanding of the state of our native trees now. And to go back to that topic that I mentioned before about data transfer and data sharing between the Red List and the NatureServe systems, we developed a new crosswalk methodology to facilitate the bulk import of data largely from NatureServe to the Red List, because that's where we had richer, deeper data to begin with. That was really helpful for this process. And so where we had up-to-date information in NatureServe, we got better at, and we were more able to sort of immediately port it over into the Red List framework and system. And so this has been a resource that I hope NatureServe can continue to use for other plant projects, for even animal projects. We'll allow it. Hopefully that is a way that we can do this sort of data sharing for conservation a little bit more effectively. And big thanks to NatureServe for all of their help to implement that, develop that tool, and hopefully that will be useful for conservationists for many years to come. So what were the results? What did we find? What is the state of our threatened and at-risk species? This is a busy slide, so I'm going to talk us through it and try to draw your attention to certain results. So on the left-hand side is a table for those 881 species, every single one of them is on here, what is the number of species and the percent of total 881 species that's in each of these Red List categories. Same thing for the right-hand side for NatureServe. So where do our trees fall in these threatened, these different categories? On the Red List, I have boxed those three categories that together constitute what we would deem a threatened species. So vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. There are 94 species on the Red List that are threatened, and that equates to 11% of those 881 species. For the NatureServe methodology, instead of using the term threatened, they use the term at risk for their aggregation of the four categories deemed to be sort of most at risk of extinction. For the NatureServe methodology, we found 135 of our 881 species were considered at risk, and that's 16% of the total. So what we then did was compare what those species were between the two different platforms. And what we found is that very often a species would be threatened and at risk. So a species would be, let's say, critically endangered on the Red List and critically imperiled on the NatureServe assessment. And so there was a lot of overlap between that 94 and 135 species, but not always. So what we also found was that you might have had a species that was vulnerable on the Red List, so qualified as threatened on the Red List, but was maybe just apparently secure for using the NatureServe methodology. Generally the same underlying data, but just a slightly different way of analyzing that data to produce these different categories. So what we then did was made a sort of separate list of those species that qualified as either Red List threatened and or NatureServe threatened. And so if you imagine it's sort of like a Venn diagram of threatened on the Red List, threatened on NatureServe, and then many species threatened on both of those platforms, the total number of species that were threatened on one or both is actually 165 species. So, you know, approaching 20%, like more like 20% of our native trees that are on one or both, considered threatened on one or both of these systems. So this 165 species is what we have used for most of the rest of these analyses when we say, is something threatened and or at risk? So I'm now going to talk about sort of some of the patterns that we saw from that data. So the first thing we did with that data set of 165 trees was say, of those, how many of these trees are actually receiving federal protections? How many of these are listed as threatened or endangered on the US Endangered Species Act? And the answer is 8 of those 165 tree species. So compare that to 94 from the Red List, 135 from NatureServe, 165 overall. Only 8 of those are currently receiving federal protections. We also looked at what the threats to US trees were. What are the common threats facing our US trees? And the way that we did this is for the Red List assessment platform, there is a standard sort of taxonomy or a standard categorization of threats. And in order to assess something as threatened on the Red List, you have to identify one or more threatening factors that are what, essentially causing this thing to like veer towards extinction. And so because there's this standardized list of threats, it makes it's very useful, because then we can take a look and say, all right, well, what are these, it's sort of a standardized way of classifying and identifying what the threats are. So we actually did this for all of the US trees, not just the threatened ones. So this graph says, of all of our trees, the blue represents species that are not threatened. So least concern or near threatened or even data deficient could be on here. The red sections of the bars are species that are in a threatened category, vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And then how many of those species have these threats been identified as influencing those species? And I'm going to read through these in case this is too small. Up at the top, so the most common threat to both our threatened and not threatened species are invasive and other problematic species, genes, and diseases. So this may be emerald ash borer influencing our ash trees, or the hemlock woody adelgid, or the chestnut blight. Those sorts of pests, diseases, fungal issues, things that are influencing the health and the ability of our native trees to grow and regenerate. Climate change and severe weather is our second most commonly cited threat for all trees. Natural system modifications, which may be something like fire suppression. For species like oaks, for example, fire can be a quite healthy part of their normal ecology. We do a lot of fire suppression. So that sort of natural system modification. Hydrology might be another thing that gets influenced by natural system modifications. Biological resource use, that might be logging. Agriculture and aquaculture are a big issue. Residential and commercial development is next. Human intrusions and disturbance, pollution, energy production and mining, transportation and service corridors, and then other options, threats that aren't captured by the rest of these categories. So these are the big issues that are influencing our trees today. And in some cases, hundreds of, over 100 species are currently being impacted by invasive and other problematic species, genes, and diseases. We then took a look at the phylogenetic patterns of threat. So of those threatened species, that list of 165 species, which ones, was there a phylogenetic pattern to which ones were most threatened? So we looked at the family level first, and what we found was that the rose and hawthorn family has the most number of at-risk or threatened species, with 34. Fagaceae, which is the oak and beech family, has the next highest number of threatened species. Then Cupressaceae, Pinaceae, Oleaceae, Ericaceae, and Rhamnaceae had high numbers of threatened species. And now this table is sorted by the number of species, but you could also take a look at this data by the percent. So we could have sorted equally, we could have sorted this by the percent of the family that was at risk. And we do have some families that are 100% threatened. So every species in the family that occurs in the US is threatened. 40 of 79 tree families have at least one threatened and or at-risk species. We looked at the genus level next, and not surprising because we had Rosaceae and Figaceae up there, the biggest genera in those two families. For Rosaceae, the contiguous, so our hawthorns, have the most number of at-risk species, 29 out of their 84. And the oaks, Quercus, have the most number of at-risk species, 17 out of their 85. Fraxinus, our ash species, again, emerald ash borer, a huge problem. Our pines, Pinus arctostaphylos, the manzanitas, common in California, and Cupressus, the cypress genus, have lots of threatened species. Again, you can also look at this at the genus level, sorting by percent, and we have many genera where all of the species are threatened with extinction. Of the 269 tree genera in the US, 77 have at least one threatened and or at-risk species. So we did that geographic assessment again. This time, these maps only are looking at those 165 species that are threatened or at risk on one or both of those threat assessment platforms. On the left, again, is the native threatened or at-risk trees. And California, Florida, Texas, and the Southeast, very similar pattern where we had our tree, just like the most number of tree species, our most tree diversity. We also have the highest threatened tree numbers in those states. California and Florida both have more than 40 threatened native tree species. Our endemic trees, again, Georgia has the highest number of endemic threatened tree species with over 30. And California, Texas, and the Southeast are where we have the most endemic threatened trees. The next analysis that we did was taking that list of all of our trees, 881 tree species, and we used a really cool tool or database that BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, manages called Plant Search. And it's the largest database of plants in cultivation around the world. It lists space, like Botanic Gardens can upload their living collections, their list of species that they cultivate and manage, into Plant Search. And you can basically identify where in the world certain tree species are growing in what botanic gardens. It also captures seed bank data too. So this is the term ex situ, or off-site, out of sight. It's not growing in its native habitat necessarily, but in one of these ex situ collections, these botanical collections. And we were really curious about how well our trees were represented in our botanical gardens and arboreta. We're an arboretum, living collection here. We have nearly 5,000 taxa of trees and of woody plants. And so I wanted to know, what are our gardens doing to capture and conserve this native tree diversity that we have? So this graph is a representation of that data. And what you see on the y-axis is the number of collections. And you can think of that as the number of botanic gardens that a species is present in. And then across the x-axis is the number of species. Again, we have the threatened trees represented by red bars and the not threatened trees represented by blue bars. And what you can see is that there are a lot of tree species that are present, that are currently represented in dozens or even hundreds of botanic garden collections around the world. This is also a global data set. So this is maybe not just US gardens. There are gardens from all over the world that have our have our native species in them. It's probably largely US gardens, but this was a global search. So there are some species, about 25 species in the world, that have between 200 and 300 botanic gardens. They are represented in over 200 public gardens. That is great, right? That we have really good representation. But I want to draw your attention to the red bars especially, and you'll see that they are bigger farther to the top of this graph, which means that there are many more, that most threatened species are represented in 0 or between 1 and 5 botanic garden collections. That is very concerning. It appears, and it's probably not surprising, but our public garden collections are much better at representing common taxa, not necessarily our very threatened trees. And I want to now focus more on that very top bar, which is those tree species that are represented in 0 botanical collections. Of the threatened and or at-risk species, there are 17 that are not anywhere in any botanic garden collection in the world. These are those 17 species. And this is an area where we can really utilize our public garden community. We have hundreds of public gardens, botanic gardens, and arboreta in the United States alone. And this would be a great place for us to focus some botanic garden collection attention. That is because if the last remaining populations of these threatened trees become extirpated in the wild, we have lost them forever. We do not have an insurance policy against extinction for those trees. So there's a real important role here for public gardens. And I want to draw attention to a program that the Morton Arboretum helps administer and leads, which is the ArbNet, Interactive Community of Arboreta. And you can go to the ArbNet website and identify the local arboretum in your state or in your country. There's a lot of different ways to sort of sort and filter and look for arboreta there. There's a big database of public gardens and of arboreta that focus on trees and woody plants. And what we've been working on is trying to connect local arboreta that are in the areas where these trees are located in the wild to try to encourage and support and facilitate them being collected and protected in public gardens. I also want to draw your attention to these 3 Quercus species, oak species that are on the list. And that is because oaks cannot be conserved in conventional seed banks. Oaks are what we call exceptional species. An exceptional species is one where the seed, in the oak's case an acorn, does not survive the conditions of a conventional seed bank, which is very cold temperatures and a dehydration step. Many plants, a lot of grasses, for example, are very amenable to seed banking. So it's a really powerful conservation tool that we have in our toolkit. It doesn't work for oaks. And so for that reason, living collections and also conservation in the wild for those species is even more important. And again, this is something where we at the Morton Arboretum, we've been very involved. We lead a network called the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak, where one of the big goals of that collective effort is to conserve oaks in the wild, but also in coordinated living collections, like living gene banks, living seed banks, where we do collecting across the range for rare species. And we bring those species into collections and into conservation so that we can do propagation, we can build those numbers up, ultimately for reintroduction to the wild. And a really exciting outcome of all of this work is that we've been partnering with the US Botanic Garden, who provided really wonderful, generous funding for one of our projects with a bunch of other partners, including San Antonio Botanic Garden and Bartlett Tree experts and UC Davis and a whole lot of other, probably 10 or 12 other institutions across the US, including BGCI and several others working to, once we identified that these trees were not in collections, we went out and we went looking for them. And last summer, the Quercus tardifolia, the species at the bottom of that list, we thought it was extinct in the wild. And we rediscovered a single tree of that species growing in Southwest Texas. And we've since sent back a bunch of collaborators. We've had several field trips and expeditions to find it. We're propagating it, we're grafting it, we're trying to protect it in the national park where it grows. to prevent it from, maybe being burned by future forest fires. So it's really exciting to see some of these assessments actually then informing conservation action, which is ultimately what we want to do. And I think that really is a great demonstration of how important public gardens and arboreta are in supporting tree conservation. I actually think that public gardens and arboreta are really uniquely positioned to have an active role in tree conservation because of some of these features of public gardens and arboreta that collectively make them so unique. So we have that robust plant science expertise on staff. We have powerful public outreach and education opportunities where we can share the importance of trees and tree conservation with our visitors and with our communities. We have expertise in horticulture and breeding. So like I described, some of these species that are really rare in the wild, we can propagate them. We have the horticultural expertise to propagate them in our gardens, but then reintroduce them to the wild and make sure that these populations are recovering. And that's that in situ conservation component. So in situ meaning in site, in the native habitat, as well as those living collections that we use for ex situ conservation. So we've talked a lot so far about how public gardens and the scientific community is kind of trying to understand the baseline level of knowledge that we need to conserve our US trees. But how can all of this information, how can we translate that and actually take action in our own homes to save threatened trees in the wild? And I want to take a few minutes now to describe what I think is really how we can take action, how you can take action, which would be things like advocating for and building awareness for the importance of trees, sharing that news with your communities, with your neighbors, with your family and friends, that trees are really essential to our health and our local habitats. Help reduce plant blindness so that trees aren't taken for granted. A lot of people don't even realize that trees can be a threatened species. Plant trees, they're a really powerful nature-based solution to combat climate change. And you'll recall that climate change was the second most commonly cited threat to our native trees. In our gardens, in our urban and suburban areas, higher canopy cover can actually cool temperatures in our cities. Cities are urban heat islands. They can do things like mitigate stormwater runoff that can ruin our soil. And trees are a carbon sink. Trees capture carbon. So they really are, planting trees in your own garden can help these trees that are threatened in the wild. We want to engage and support private landowners to plant trees. In the Chicago region, 70% of our trees are on private property. So there really is a whole lot of action and roles that we can have as private landowners. And having a diverse urban canopy is more resilient to those new pests and diseases. So emerald ash borer, for example, you'll recall invasive species, a big issue. We replanted, after all our elms came out because of Dutch elm disease, we replanted our streets with only ash. Now all of our ash trees are having to come out. So planting diversity in your gardens and advocating for that in your urban forestry practices can make a big difference. We want to create forest preserves and connect habitat in our urban areas so that we have habitat corridors and we can bring some of that nature home and support biodiversity even in the places where we live and work. And we want to ensure that threatened tree species are included in that work, in that habitat restoration and in protected areas. We want to influence and advocate for threatened tree species there. So it could be like a near situ conservation project. And support your local public garden or arboretum. They really have fantastic innovative programs. At the Morton Arboretum, we run the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, which is a partnership of communities, individuals, organizations, green industry, businesses, and governments working together to develop and implement strategies for a healthier, more diverse, and equitable urban forest, which really can have a positive impact on our trees around the country. So just to run through our key points and final conclusions here, 11 to 16% or 94 to 135 species are threatened with extinction in the lower 48 United States. Only 8 of those are currently receiving federal protections under the Endangered Species Act. Oaks and hawthorns have the most tree species and the most threatened tree species in the US. Texas, California, and the Southeast are where we have our tree hotspots and our threatened tree hotspots. Our common threats are invasive pests and diseases, climate change, biological resource use, and natural system modification. 17 of those threatened trees are not protected in any public garden. And if they disappear from the wild, we'll lose them forever. But urban forests and home gardens can contribute significant benefits to biodiversity, and our individual actions can improve the state of the nation's trees and forests. So we can take action right in our own homes and gardens. And with that, I will wrap it up. I just realized we don't have a ton of time for questions. I went longer than I thought. I'm really sorry about that, but
Okay.
hopefully some people stuck around.
They did. Thank you, Murphy. That was just terrific. And I want to remind people that was a lot of information. So we do have recorded Murphy's presentation, and we will have that up in our video library soon, so that you'll be able to go over that. I think there's two questions I just want to take time to be able to ask you. One, why so few trees on the federal threatened list? What do we do to get more of those on?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that we are finding is that some of these threats are happening so quickly. And federal protections and agencies, like the list of petitioned species for the Federal Endangered Species Act is really long. It's, I think it's one of these things where that things can change so quickly, right? You can have a new pest or disease come in. In many ways, we're kind of only just discovering, that things are as dire as they are for so many of these species. And so I think it is just kind of a race to get to that point. I think the other thing too is that Endangered Species Act is largely focused on those most threatened taxa, and so they kind of do triangulate around the critically endangered level of trees. And so I understand the importance and the value of that, but one of the things where I think we can really have influence is it can be really hard to recover a tree that has 50 individuals left in the wild. So what can we be doing for those trees that are still essential and playing a really powerful and impactful role in their local ecosystems, like the fabric of their ecosystems? They're still providing essential habitat, and they're still playing a real significant role, but they're declining. And maybe they're not at that critically endangered place yet, and so maybe they don't merit that federal protections yet. But what can we do to not let it get to such a dire state?
Sounds like we need a bunch of oak plantations so that we can, just like corn and others, that the seed doesn't last for very long, to be able to do it. But I want to thank you so much. I also want people to know that we take this very seriously at the Smithsonian, and we are co-hosting the World Forum on Urban Forests this fall. You'll see more about it on our website as well as the WFUF website. But thank you, Murphy. Thank you for helping protect our trees. Go out and hug one.
Yes, deal. And Arbor Day is coming up. Go out and plant one.
Yes, go out. Yeah, that's true. Forgot about Arbor Day. Actually, I couldn't forget we have a program coming up. So thank you again. And thank you for all of you that joined us. And we hope to see you again next week for another terrific topic. Thanks, Murphy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.